Welcome to the Philos Project Podcast. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and this week we speak with Hussein Mansour to discuss the post-Enlightenment German philosophical political thought that is shaping the cultural discourse surrounding the Israel-Hamas war, public support amongst Gen Z for not just the Palestinians, but Hamas, a designated terrorist organization, and to put into context what we're seeing happen across American universities in the wake of what has been both disruptive protests and almost, I think, using the word rioting and anarchy would be appropriate for campuses like Columbia, Chapel Hill, and UCLA. We're going to discuss the Enlightenment, what that meant for the West, both the Anglo-Saxon West, so us here in America, and for the Germanic West, so German philosophical thoughts leading to Karl Marx, Marxism, and what that means for the Neo-Marxist kind of cultural revolution sweeping the West today. I'm really excited for this conversation. It is both salient, it is important, and it is complex and multifaceted, and Hussein does an incredible job of walking us through it. I hope you enjoy the conversation. And today I am revisited with a prior guest of the Deep Map, Hussein Mansour. Welcome to the Philos Project Podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
For those who have not watched or listened to Hussein's episode on the Deep Map, I highly recommend you go visit that. I will put that in the show notes below. And for people who might be coming to this podcast and not having met you before, Hussein, could you give us a brief introduction about your background and the space you occupy intellectually?
Thank you. My name is Hussein Mansour. I'm originally from Egypt. Been living in the United States since 2012, so 12 years now. And I've been my primary concern has been Arab and Muslim, modern Arab and Muslim political culture in the way that it organized itself in this last century around its struggle against Israel or against Zionism and against the United States at large. And the central place that anti-Semitism has been playing in the just mass culture, mass political culture of the Middle East. Anybody who's kind of vaguely aware knows that anti-Semitism has always been an issue, not to mention, of course, the issues of violence, political radicalism. Despite that, there has been a lot of theories, I think, throughout the decades trying to explain that. Why is the Middle East so dysfunctional? Why so much violence? Why are so much terrorism? Why is it so resistant to modernization, democratization, liberalization, so on and so forth? What causes this weird obsession with Israel, despite the conflict is real, but it by no means the biggest conflict in the region or the world. It doesn't affect the lives of that many people. It just things don't make sense. And if you've had a lot of theories trying to explain why is that so, whether blaming it on the culture of the region itself, so you have factors in the culture, tribalism and so on, Islam, there's a problem, structural problem in the foundation of the religion itself, or you have also you have leftist theories or theories that come from the left trying to explain the region, which basically blames it on imperialism, the United States, the exploitative structure that the United States and Western Europe has set in place, so on and so forth, with its alliance with the forces of local reaction, or so to speak, local tyrants. So you have all of these theories. And I grew up in Egypt, and I lived a lot of this. I was a young man during the Arab Spring, and I've been always concerned with these questions, and I found none of them to be satisfactory. I mean, I played with these answers. That's what you do, right? Once you start, you try to take answers and play with them. But I never truly found them satisfactory in any way. They didn't truly explain fully my experience. They could superficially, at the first instance, it can be, you can feel some satisfaction. Okay, I found it. That's it. But then you start poking a little bit, and things start fall through, and they are unsatisfactory again. I tried then to look for an answer myself, and the answer that I got is much more complicated and has to do with a long duration study of how the modern Middle East got shaped, what influenced it. in the ideas of nationalism, political organization, its ideas of identity, ideas of religion, ideas of the self. And that's my conclusion, that the Middle East has been heavily influenced by single strains of specifically German post-Enlightenment ideologies and Enlightenment philosophies that could only have radical and violent outcomes, and it shaped the mass culture of a lot of Middle Eastern societies. By any means, not all of them. So the most modern ones will be the ones that suffer the most. So Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, the Palestinians themselves, Egypt. These are actually have been for so long before the rise of Riyadh today and Dubai and Abu Dhabi. These were considered the most mobile and the most modern Arab societies, and they are the ones who manifest many times the most resistant forms of these problems that we mentioned. And that's basically what I focused on, and that led me also to, aside from the purely historical interest in just knowing, how things happened, that led me also to look at today differently, especially the intersection between radical Islamic movements and radical leftist movements, not just as I think it gets reduced very often in a lot of polemics against these movements as useful idiots. It's a coalition of the resentful, they just opportunism. And I started to see more than that. These are groups that actually share ideological affinities and in deep ideological affinities in how they share the world, because ultimately the conceptual frame that shapes their way of thinking belong to the same German strains of philosophy and ideology, and so on and so forth. Their idea of the self, their idea of struggle, their idea of justice, their idea of fairness. I've been trying to, first of all, I still trying to understand these things better because they are not so easy, and they require vast knowledge of various historical contexts, not just Middle Eastern, not just Arab, not just Muslim, but all of those, of course, but also European. And you have to also, and then you have to ask yourself, okay, how were things before? How did Muslims, or Arab Muslims specifically, how did they understand history before these German ideas? How did they understand the world? Is there really a substantial difference that can justify a claim that their worldview was kind of rebuilt anew in the early 20th century? And as I'm doing these things, of course, things happen in the real world that necessitate that I discuss these things more with the public in order to try to help offer new questions, if not new answers, but just new ways to look at things.
That's really insightful. You covered a lot of what I want to talk to you about today, which is that intersection with Islamic political thought in the Middle East and Neo-Marxism or far left ideologies here in the West. And since we last talked on the DMAP episode, there's been seemingly this social contagion with the rise in popularity of Neo-Marxism, rise of anti-Semitism on college campuses. We talked about, the Palestinian question being this symbol of morality for the left. But I think now young college students are not just outwardly sympathizers with the Palestinian cause, but with Hamas, a terrorist organization. So I would love to kind of settle there and help us understand, because on the surface, a lot of this doesn't seem to make sense. You have these liberal, pro-queer, pro-woman, anti-gun violence college students, then simultaneously standing in solidarity with Hamas. And so it seems to be an ideological contradiction, but because of those shared German post-Enlightenment ideas, it might not be as dissimilar as it might appear on the surface. So maybe if we could just start with, what do you think has contributed to this moment that we're sitting in and this social contagion I mentioned of Neo-Marxism and anti-Semitism across some of our most prestigious campuses here in the United States?
It's a loaded question, and I don't know if I can offer a clear answer. I can offer some of the ways I think about it. I just want to make a clarification about what I think is happening. I think there are multiple things happening at the same time, and I think that's true for any major events. You just have a kind of collusion of many trends and currents that have been ongoing for some time, and they kind of meet together to create an event that we experience as unitary. And I don't think we truly can understand what happened until after the fact. So I think, although it's very important to try today to reflect on while you're in the moment, I think a better understanding will necessarily have to wait for the future after it actually has subsided. There are not everybody who's protesting for Palestine, whether they were brown or white, whether they were leftist or Arabist or Islamist, or not all of them understand fully the issues, nor they are committed to a full articulated ideological premise. I would actually say that the vast majority of the young people know very little about these issues, and their protest is a product of a valorization of radicalism that happened in the United States in the past years. And I think there are major political institutions paid or played into the hands of this by valorizing and encouraging anger and resentment and protest as some sort of demonstrations of one's inner commitment to beautiful values and justice, so on and so forth. And I think a lot of people understand these things very intuitively. A lot of people do not truly fully understand, or not even well informed about these issues. But as you said, there's an element of social contagion. So people just, most people do what other people in their group doing. There has been for years now a sustained attack. Not just I'm not going to even start talking about the universities yet, but even just in the mainstream media, on the history of the United States, the identity of the United States, all the moral values that the United States once claimed for itself, as if they were always lies. This country has been misogynistic, sexist, racist, so on and so forth. So these things have been in the air for a very long time. We remember the issues around the major anti-racism protests that happened right after COVID. I think it was in 2020. We saw the coverage in the media. We saw how a certain political faction in the United States responded to it and even encouraged it to a large degree. So there is that context that cannot be dismissed. There has been an encouragement of radicalism at culture at large, especially for young people who are hailed as symbols of, progress and truth and so on. So that's number one. Number two, you have groups of very committed activists for Arab and Muslim causes, namely for Palestine, who've been active on campuses I would say, for decades. They have faculty members, they have student groups, they have Muslim student groups, Arab student groups, and these, I think, when you look, you'll find that they constitute the core of the protest movement. They are the ones who really own the cause, and of course they sit in the intersectional coalition with a lot of other protest groups, from Ferguson to Palestine and that kind of idea. And then you have, of course, hardcore leftist activists who are in the intersectional coalition, and who, some of them are aware of the Palestinian cause. Some of them dedicated their lives to it. You have faculty members, Norman Finkelstein, the guy is even Jewish. You have people like Judith Butler. While it's not her cause, so the Palestinian cause is not Butler's cause, gender is, but she has a long history of making statements and utterances on the Palestinian cause, saying it's part of the causes of the left, Hamas and Hezbollah. She has a famous quote. Nobody knew it. I used to tell it to people before October 7th. Now a lot of people know it. She spoke, I think, 10 years ago, and she said, we have to see Hamas and Hezbollah as part of the international left. This is the major theoretician, the world's largest theoretician on gender issues. It considers the truly chauvinistic, misogynist groups of Hamas and Hezbollah, causes them actually allies. So you do have all of these radical professoriate, and they are the ones who created these conditions in the classrooms for decades. So you have actual developments that have been going on for a very long time that shaped the discourse, I think, in the universities around the issues of social justice. When it comes to the Middle East specifically, they shaped the idea that people saw Israel, they saw the United States intervention in the Middle East, or presence in the Middle East, and gradually these views became dominant. in part because the people who were committed to them were really committed to them. There's also the issue of foreign funding, money of Qatar. I don't talk about that because I think people overemphasize it, not because it's not real, but because I think it runs into the danger of blaming my problem on impurities that are coming from the inside, as if everything here is perfect. You don't have people who've been radicalizing your kids for decades in the universities. So yeah, when it comes to the Middle East discourse or discourse around the Middle East, this has been a reality for I would say since the late '60s. These radical views came to dominate or started to rise in Middle East studies. By the late '70s, with the rise of Edward Said specifically, they actually started to dominate the Middle East Studies department, and some of them even seeped to Jewish Studies departments. And they created almost a consensus on how this is how you see the Middle East. Israel is a settler colonialist endeavor supported by an imperialist power. There is a kind of a symbiotic relationship between this United States imperialism and Jewish colonialism in the Middle East. And you didn't have a lot of people actually genuinely challenging that, other than polemics. You didn't have any genuine challenge. I think a lot of liberal professoriates actually not adopted. They didn't challenge the view. They kind of saw legitimacy in it. So in my graduate school years in Middle East studies, I found professoriate that I would not call neo-Marxist. Actually still calling the United States imperialist. The United States is a reason for disruption of the Middle East, our own militancy and military industrial. They use the same kind of concept. And I think that's generally something that happened in the social sciences, in which the liberal tradition of social analysis actually, I would say, even died. I think a lot of people would protest and object to this. I have a lot of friends who teach liberal political theory at colleges, and I'm sorry to say, it feels like a dead tradition. It doesn't have innovation. That's not what most young people want to study. That's not where most of the publications today actually come from. The most is actually coming from the leftist tradition that became dominant. What you rightfully call neo-Marxist. I mean, there is always a game of euphemism whenever you talk about these things. Where are those neo-Marxists? Well, there are no Marxists? I have arguments sometimes with committed Marxists, and they deny completely that this has anything to do with Marxism. This is basically just liberal identitarian decadence that you see in the universities. So even a committed Marxist would deny that this has anything to do with Marxism. But the truth is that all of these perspectives, all of these ideological radical tools that indoctrinated so many young people for long, they come from specifically the Western Marxist tradition. Marxism itself, it's like a world religion. It would not be an exaggeration to describe it as the largest world religion that rose in the world probably since the rise of Protestantism or even the rise of Islam. And its evolution often takes the form of world religion. So you have inner schisms. You have very severe theological debates. You have people who are declaring that the other person is not really Marxist. Only they represent what real Marxism should be. So these are kind of some of the scholastic and Byzantine arguments among these scholars. None of them actually matters. If you actually look at things very objectively, it's very clear that a lot of these radical tools are downstream from Marxism. You can't really call them Marxism. I would not call it Marxism in the sense that it's not really committed anymore to a working class revolution. It's not really committed to communism the way that the Soviets were committed to communism. But it is a specifically Western form of the decomposition of Marxist theories into various social science disciplines. And these are the ones who a lot of these young people grew up with or received their education with. You have a complete domination, as I said, of these forms of thought in the university. And that means not most of your faculty is actually competent at what they do. And not most of them are, I would say, very scholarly. So you have a lot of scholars, especially in the recent decades, who've been pure activists, have been really radicalizing young people with really irresponsible critiques of what they call empire, which is that's kind of the word for capitalism that has been used intensively, and these things are received by young people at the level of slogans. They don't necessarily understand the analytical structures behind them, but they come down to slogans, and then that's what you see on the campus. You see Iran make us proud, or Hamas makes us proud. All of these kind of slogan that you see, and of course that then it becomes very natural to the Muslim and Arab students who grew up with a lot of these forms at home, and basically creates this large event. I'm sorry I went everywhere.
No, that's perfect. Well, just to speak to my own experience. So I graduated undergrad in 2020, grad school in 2022, Florida State University, a public big state school here in Florida. And I studied Judith Butler in the classroom, this lens and framework of critical theory. So the oppressor-oppressed paradigm that's applied to a myriad of social issues, whether it be gender, queer issues, feminist issues, climate justice, racial justice here in the United States, which was adopted by BLM. And I really attribute the social contagion that came after BLM to kind of the colloquial use of critical theory academic language on the streets, on college campuses. I think that's always been present in academic thought, but now there's almost like this social lexicon that's come with this social contagion. That's just super fascinating. And I would love to kind of piggyback off of, this neo-Marxist consensus on the Palestinian issue. You spoke about this in the Deep Map episode, but maybe if you could expand upon it again on how or why the Palestinian issue has become an organizing moral principle that shapes reality for the Arab world and the Middle East, maybe for different reasons, but also the left-leaning neo-Marxist coalition here in the West. Why is it, this Palestinian question, as you mentioned, there's other parts of the world that have experienced larger death rates, authoritarian regimes. So what is it about this issue, even in the academic space here in the West, that has perpetuated this social conversation?
It's a great question. Before I answer it, I have a small remark about what you said about critical theory. It still strikes me and shocks me that intelligent people in the United States who truly care about the future of their country are still not alarmed by the fact that the vocabulary and the terminology of something so esoteric as critical theory, something that's really critical theory is a peculiar development in German intellectual history specifically. Something like that became so pervasive in American culture that you have, suburban soccer moms fighting over a critical theory in board school meetings, school board meetings. I think any intelligent person who's observant, who understands how things should work or how things usually work, should really stop here. There is something weird happening in the United States, in which universities, first of all, have such a pervasive influence on the entire country, and then that you have such esoteric academic disciplines originated in closed corners in Europe, becoming kind of the lingo, even as you said, of the streets social protest. I think it's timely that we admit that we haven't been looking at the right places. I have a lot of criticism that I try to make gently about. I'm originally not from here. I'm an outsider, so I have a lot of criticism that I like to make gently about the thinking people, or people who are supposed to be thinking for a living in this country, that they haven't been actually doing their job properly. If this has suddenly exploded and you have no idea where it came from, I think it's time to ask serious questions, to revise what kind of questions have you been thinking, what did you miss? About Palestine. So this has very long history in the Middle East. We talked about in the Deep Map. It really evolved. There were stages to it. You can't really. That's also another failure, I think, of people who think about these issues. They think it must have been one thing all the time. So let's say anti-Semitism. That's kind of eternal. They've been. It's really not. Once you actually go down and look into the details on how things happened, you discover, I'm not saying that it's not it is anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism doesn't work in a vacuum. You have to have some sort of a context that gives anti-Semitism its meaning within your current struggle in that way. When the struggle between Zionists and the Arabs first emerged, I think in the 1930s up until 1948, I think it would be fair to say that it was mostly truly political and territorial, with some ideological influences that had to do with the Nazi propaganda in the Middle East that infused, and Russian propaganda in the Middle East as well, that infused the region with a very large dose of European anti-Semitism. Now, European anti-Semitism itself has, you can trace it in the Middle East, I think, to if I'm not mistaken, 1844. That was the first time that the blood libel of European origin through and through appeared in Syria. It's a famous case. It's the reason Moses has abandoned communism and pretty much invented Zionism afterwards. But this influence expedited significantly in the 1920s, 1930s. But yet, I would say it was not. It was not existential. That is, what anti-Semitism is often missed. I think what's missed about anti-Semitism in the United States, including, by the way, again, I have critiques for everyone, including in Holocaust and anti-Semitic education, that it's decontextualized. It's made something eternal on its own. And I think that's very unhelpful for people to understand. So it becomes this weird form of racism associated with the most ignorant and vulgar people, which is really not the case. Anti-Semitism was part of some of the most dramatic chapters of the European Enlightenment. It was central to a lot of the emerging philosophies and doctrines. There's not a single major, at least German, which was the richest part of the European Enlightenment. There's not a single German thinker or philosopher that did not write about Jews, that did not leave some body of anti-Semitic writings, and the writings were not random or sporadic. Like, they were not, what is the word, chiming in? They were not chiming in on the trend or the fad. Partly so, but they were doing so within their own philosophical system. And that has to do with the nature of German philosophy in general, that it has to be systematic. Everything has to be total and unitary in a whole system. In the 1920s, 1930s, I think this anti-Semitic influence was in the Middle East was still on the level of propaganda. That is, it's a sentiment truly, not really attached to any worldview in particular. It's just imagery that came from Europe that were used in the struggle against Zionism. You start getting a very different picture in the 1940s and the 1950s, as this anti-Semitism actually receives, the struggle against Zionism receives an actual philosophical articulation within the first emerging ideology to modernize Middle Eastern societies, which was Arab nationalism. And in it, the struggle against Zionism was considered to be, or was made by the thinkers of Arab nationalism, to be the vehicle of Arab self-realization. So all of these German ideologies are built on a philosophy of history. That is, you have to have a story, and that story has to have a meaning, a philosophy of history, and from that story, from that meaning, then emerges the ideology. So whether communism is built, of course, it's called Hegelian Marxism, so it's built on the philosophy of history of Hegel, or various forms of romantic nationalism were built on Hegel. Fascism and Nazism were Hegelian through and through. As a matter of fact, Giovanni Gentile, who was the main thinker of fascism, the main philosopher of fascism, Italian, he actually shared a mentor with Antonio Gramsci, who was kind of the father figure of Italian communism. And that father figure was Benedetto Croce. Benedetto Croce was the biggest Hegelian scholar, or the scholar of Hegel, in Italy. And in the writings of Gentile himself about Marxism, in which he's trying to take Marxism apart, the fascists hated Marxists and the Marxists hated the fascists, he basically wrote that this is not real Hegelianism, that his own version of Hegelianism is superior. I don't want to get people into these esoteric philosophical issues, but just philosophy of history is kind of the foundation of this. You have to have a view of history, of universal history, the history of humanity, and that history has to lead you into a salvific moment in which there's a protagonist. So this protagonist in which that will bring that salvation could be the proletariat, or it could be the German nation, or the Italian nation, or the Arab nation, or Islam. Through a struggle with the world or against the world, in which the struggle intensifies until it reaches, its explosion, this salvation will finally come, and the end of history will be reached. That's kind of a extremely simplified idea of that is. You started to have actual articulated Arab writings that offer this view of the Arab people, the Arab nation, that is eternal, that has a mission, a universal mission for mankind, that is marching in history. And now this Arab nation is its struggle for self-realization, for self-making. So there's also the this humanist idea of humanity creating itself is against Zionism. That is a struggle through which Arabs will be born. There are no Arabs, but the Arab will be born, will be realized in a struggle with Zionism. You get these actual writings that become a base of ideology that reaches power in Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq, amongst the most educated Arab populations. Not just it reaches power, but it reaches power at the moment of creating the Arab mass society. Mass societies did not exist before. It's a new phenomenon worldwide. Of course, it started in Europe and then it became everywhere. And that was the moment in Arab mass societies were born. So they were born with that as the foundational understanding of their identity, of who they are, of their role in history. And then mixed with this, as this Arab nationalism also acquired a third worldist and socialist and Marxist nature in the 1950s during the Cold War, you had then a formula in which this struggle against Zionism is also a struggle against the world's most evil power, which is capitalism, represents in the United States, and imperialism. As a matter of fact, the entire analysis had become much more sophisticated by the 1950s. That is, the true forces that are standing against the freedom of the Arab people, the Arab liberation, is that of capitalism and colonialism and American imperialism. And Israel is just the local agent of this imperialism that is in cahoots or in alliance with local power of reaction. So now the great Arab nation is a struggle against an evil trinity that's made of imperialism, Zionism, and reaction. And when it defeats that trinity, then it will emerge victorious. Of course, all what I said before, it went into this as well. So the Nazi influence from 2 decades earlier went into this kind of, you're talking about an accumulating waves. The Soviets, of course, played into this heavily. Now, the story of the Soviets and Zionism itself is much more complicated. The Soviets have been opposed since the 1920s to Zionism. And just very briefly, the line that the Soviets always insisted, the Marxists or the Leninists always insisted on, that there is no solution for the Jewish question but inside of communism. That is, Jews have to stop becoming Jews and become communists. That's the only way that the Jewish question will be resolved. Zionism is just basically adopting capitalism and imperialism and so on. These views were basically became the institutionalized views of Arab Republic, progressive, what was called then progressive Arab republics. The international left adopted this because it came out of a Leninist, maybe not with the Arab nationalist components of it, but it definitely adopted the Marxist components. The most clear articulation of this, and I know I've been talking for so long now, so I'll try to make it brief. You will find it actually, I think, in the October issue of the Monthly Review magazine. The Monthly Review magazine, I don't know if I talked about this in the last episode. The Monthly Review magazine is the oldest running Marxist publication in the United States. It has a name. It's really a historical institution. It's actually one of the earliest and most prestigious Marxist publications. The first issue, and socialist publication, the first issue, the inaugural issue, and the inaugural statement was written by Albert Einstein. Why socialism? So it was the Marxist publication in the United States, especially before the New Left Review was established in England. In the October issue of 1967, so the issue a few months after the Six-Day War, Paul Sweezy, who was the editor of the Monthly Review and one of the most important American Marxist thinkers, wrote the editorial on why Palestine. Exactly your question. All right. So the Arabs have, as I said, they convinced themselves this is the struggle that determines their freedom, that determines their being, that determines their survival, their culture in history. If they don't win it, they will be crushed by the wheel of history and they will be forgotten. Well, why European and American leftists care so much about Palestine? And in the it's a remarkable article. Actually, if people want to understand kind of the historical evolution of this, I would refer them to go back and read it. And in it, Paul Sweezy starts saying a couple of years ago there was a big war between India and Pakistan that almost became nuclear. We did not write about it, and we did not care, and our audience did not care that we did not care. Like the people who buy the monthly review didn't send angry letters. How dare you not mention this big conflict? But this one is different. The ones between Arabs and Israel, 1967. This matters because as Marxists, we care about the epochal or the struggles of the epoch. That is, the struggles that define the current stage of struggle between the productive forces and the forces of capitalism. And that was it. And basically tried to explain that the way that the international market is set up, this is the context of the 60s. So this context will change later, despite the position going to find just a new argument. Back then, the United States depended, or a lot of the Western industrial base dependent on oil, or their energy needs really met from the Middle East. So the idea was Western industry that keeps capitalism alive, oppressing all of those people, depends for energy in order to run on the Middle East. So Western imperialism wants to keep the Middle East divided, weak, destroyed, so they can exploit and extract all the oil that they want. And their way of doing this is allowing the Jews to start a colonialist endeavor in the middle of the Middle East in order to destroy any Arab progressive force. That's kind of, and that's basically why the struggle of the Arabs against Israel is the most important struggle outside of the West for the future of the revolution. If the Arabs win and destroy Israel, they will withhold oil from the West. If they withhold oil from the West, industry will be in the West will be disrupted. If industry in the West will be disrupted, people will become resentful. The proletariat, the Western working class, will be stirred up, and then we can have a revolution. So that was kind of the idea in the 60s. It continued in the 1970s. By the end of the 1970s, these ideas started to wither away because basically you had a rise of the new left, or what we call Western Marxism, or Neo-Marxism, that really had different understandings of the world than the revolution and the working class. Actually didn't care about the working class anymore. Nevertheless, it continued the same position in aligning itself with what it called the Arab progressive forces. And I failed to mention here that the Palestinian cause itself, as you see it today, was a part of the rise of the new left. That is, the Palestinian cause, as you understand it, as you see it, with its symbols, with the Yasser Arafat, with the flags, with the kafia, with the PFLP, the militias, the militant actions, it did not rise, or didn't really come to be, but within that context of the new left. So it was part of it from the very beginning. I'll stop here, and I hope that this somehow shed some light on the origins of some of these things.
No, it does. And even just the complexity of it, I think, points to the lack of knowledge that these college students have, because they can't articulate any of this philosophical or political kind of roots to the ideas they possess. They just know the word struggle, justice, liberation. Those are like the heuristics for this movement, but it doesn't go deeper than that.
Slogans. It comes down truly to the street as slogans. Yeah.
Slogans, yeah, bite-sized little slogans, but they're weighted terms. And I want to, my next question is going to ask, like, what does struggle and justice and fairness mean in the German post-Enlightenment tradition? But I think it's interesting too, listening to you talk, it does sound like a religion. It sounds salvific, eschatological. And even if you look at these college campuses, a lot of the students will say, liberation for Palestine means liberation for all. And so it is like this symbolic idea of liberation against everything that
Yeah, it's a total idea. You're absolutely right, man. That's the whole. It's a whole system. So all of these ways of thinking are total and cohesive and interrelational. That is, you can't understand one component unless you understand the entire system. If and every component, the analysis of single component gives you the analysis of the entire system. So, for example, I just talked to you about how the Palestinian cause was seen by somebody like Paul Swayze, and that meant that I had to explain how the view of the entire capitalist system is. They are all closely interrelated. It's all total, and that agree. That goes also with the idea of liberation, right? So the liberation for one means the liberation of all, making a tangible progress in a limited area doesn't mean that there is liberation at all, right? As long as we're all not liberated, as long as it's not the liberation of the whole, then it's not real.
Mm-hmm. If we could just even go back, just also to add some context to this, because when we last spoke, I had this epiphany of like, oh, wait, the Enlightenment wasn't just for the Anglo-Saxon West. Like the Enlightenment looked different for the French and for the Germans. So if you could just maybe provide some context to the Enlightenment and how these different political schools of thought kind of branched out, and just to define the Enlightenment for our audience. I'm sure everyone learned about Locke and Hobbes in high school. It's the long 18th century, so the late 1600s to the early 1800s. What did those traditions look like outside of the American West for our audience that might think of it just as the American kind of tradition?
It's an amazing question. It's first of all, I have to clarify. I'm not a professor of philosophy. I'm just really a guy who came from Egypt and trying to figure out why the country I came from is so messed up. And then I found myself reading 18th century German philosophers to figure out. So I'm doing my best. And you're right. I mean, a lot of I think Americans in general, and it's like religious traditions really, and religious traditions don't really talk to each other. They could sometimes aware of the namely existence of everyone, of each other, but they really don't share much. And I'll give an example. For example, the Trinity. The Trinity is a core Christian doctrine that anybody looking from outside of Christianity completely does not. I mean, most Christians don't understand it either, but it looks even weirder and implausible and impossible to the extent of being fraudulent from outside of Christianity, right? People who are not Christian look at it from the outside, and they don't get it. While if they actually get into the tradition, they might actually understand how does it work, what does it mean, so on and so forth. So that's just an analogy of how the Enlightenment, yes, Enlightenment was not one thing. It was actually major different events, philosophical events that lasted centuries in different places and created different intellectual traditions of how to think about these things. It was um, a, a major upheaval, conceptual upheaval in the way that people conceive reality and people conceive the self. I mean, think about notions of identity, notions of history itself did not exist before the Enlightenment. The meaning of history, the nation state, political organization, moral philosophy, and it will be very hard for me to try to say. I mean, it's a big philosophical question itself. What was the Enlightenment? But it will be also even harder to try to just talk about its different parts. But one of its main parts was actually trying to produce a moral philosophy. So think about the Enlightenment also as the world or the Europeans stepping out of Christianity. A lot of the Enlightenment philosophers were ambiguous about this issue because I think just fear of censorship. But if you actually went down to it, no, they were leaving Christianity, and they were trying to construct a real knowledge. You know, Christianity was a prejudice. Let's say the religion. There is no justification for religious beliefs, but pure prejudice. So now was the time to actually construct a real knowledge that is not prejudice. And there are knowledge of a lot of things. So you have the natural sciences, but also you have the social sciences that came out of this. And of course, you have the moral question. So it was okay when we were religious. It had a system of morality. It was based on prejudice, but it was there. What are we gonna base morality on? So there were part of the Enlightenment was creating a system of morality that is real, so to speak, that is objective. And he had different attempts. For example, I think Kantian morality is one of the most famous attempts. And any philosophy of morality had to be built on a principle of justification, right? How do I justify actions? And these attempts created, think about it as a machine that just churned out at the speed of like, 1,000 concepts a minute, all of these different concepts, the concepts of right, the concept of civil society, the concept of ethics itself, the concepts of virtues, in order to try to build this new knowledge. And then you had, as you said, you had the French were doing their own thing. The English, mainly the Scots. I mean, it's really the Anglo-Saxon world was really the Scots, the one who carried the day to a large degree. And then, of course, you had the German. And the German Enlightenment ended up being the richest. It's actually not the Anglo-Saxon. The Germans talked about Locke often as this, a sage, but it's kind of the philosophy of the shopkeeper. That is, very simple, very small. The German philosophy is much richer. It's vast. What you get with the Germans, you get this very vast discourse at the expense of accuracy. So you really, you spend years debating a single concept, try to find out what it means. I would argue that by the nature of that endeavor, you can never find what these things mean. But the vast, almost endless discourse. On the other side, the English or the Anglo-American tradition, you get this very limited, tourniqueted discourse. So you get much narrower. But of course, you get much higher accuracy. And the German, specifically with German idealism, now there's a big background of why it became so. But German idealism, there are some presupposition in German idealism that even till today, experts of German idealism take it for granted. That is, German idealism think that only philosophy could only happen or could only be done as a system. That is, it must be systematic. Everything has to be connected to everything else, and the entire system must be based on one absolute principle. That's the German idea of philosophy. Any philosophy that's not systematic is not philosophy, and that's why Locke is, an endearing man, but he's not really a philosopher. He was not really a systematic thing. He did not create a system that tried to explain the total of human experience, whether moral or social or metaphysical or physical or the natural sciences or so on and so forth. And ultimately this, I mean, we talked earlier about the explanation of Paul Sweezy, and maybe you already can see the affinity or the relationship between this very total way of thinking and what became Marxism. Because basically what Marx did is that he took German idealism, which was philosophy, until Marx, to be clear, it was only philosophy. That is, it was understood as a primarily mental vocation. It's an intellectual activity. It was still problematic. You had people already in the late 18th century, like Frederick Jacobi, who thought that it's disaster and it will bring nihilism. He actually coined the term. So the term nihilism was actually coined within the discourse of German philosophy by a man who was warning from the dangers of philosophy in that manner. What Marx did is he took these philosophies and in the Marxist term, he made them world. It's philosophy made world. It's philosophy that goes to the street. The philosophers were delusional, who thought that these ideas are abstractions, and they didn't know it's basically distorted reflections on what's going on in society. And that's kind of what a lot of these militant ideologies were born, specifically out of this German way of thinking that had its way to think about thinking and had its own way to think about history and had its own way to think about the world. And the one thing that characterized all of that thinking, that it had to be total. It had to be contained in a total system that permits nothing outside of it.
And what do the slogans we talked about, struggle, justice, fairness, what does that mean within the context of that system for the German tradition?
Well, now you will have to get into more the details. So revolution and struggle, the Germans didn't invent that. It's really that prize goes to the French. The French Revolution happened exactly at the same time at these major intellectual breakthroughs happened in Germany. What basically happened is that you had the articulation of political causes by this way of thinking, and that was what Marx actually first achieved by articulating the cause for the revolution. That's what Marxism actually became a science of revolution. Within that Hegelian idealist philosophy that he made materialist. That is, he flipped it. It's not really about ideas. It's about social phenomena. It's just that our philosophers have been just, drinking too much to realize that this is not about ideas. That's actually about us, about people. And then here the concepts of revolution and struggle acquired a deep and philosophical and rich meaning that doesn't exist in the lexical or common sense usage, right? So first of all, were inserted into a system, so they are not standalone concepts anymore, right? It's a concept within a system that, in order to understand it, you have to understand the entire system. And it contained in each one of them is the actual teleology or the actual nature or the principle of the whole system. So the concept of struggle here becomes almost identical with the realization of the whole, of the entire system. The struggle is not just merely a method among many methods to achieve a certain objective that you have in mind. So that's the way that common sense, and that's what the Anglo-American tradition is called. It's called the common sense philosophy. That's the way that common sense thinking about this would put these. For example, the civil rights movement, an American, especially back in the 50s, would think about the civil rights movement as a struggle for a very clear and defined objective, which is civil rights for African Americans. And once you achieve that, then the struggle is over. Now we're talking about an idea of struggle in which that struggle means a realization of a whole system. So it's by nature against a whole system. It's not really for a specific goal. And if you talk a lot of these kids, these kids, I am absolutely sure they have no clue about any of this. But when you tell them, they tell you, no, the struggle is not really just for Palestine or for the rights of women. It's a struggle against capitalism. The structure is the problem. The entire structure needs to be dismantled. So there is this totalitarian, a clear totalitarian and total ambition that is built in it, that even if you don't understand how these things work, that's really what you get. So the struggle here is your means. It's everything. Truly, it's everything. It's your means of self-creation. It's healing the world. It's healing yourself. It's creating solidarity. It's relating to your fellow man. It's fixing injustice. It's actually achieving humanity. So that these systems ultimately are about the realization of humanity or humanism. Especially, there was a major figure between Hegel and Marx. I don't think he's studied enough. I think he's actually quite major, Ludwig Feuerbach. And actually, the humanistic atheism of today, that's actually Feuerbach. We trace a lot of atheism that we see around us. It comes almost directly, not directly. There are a lot of mediators in the middle, but ultimately you can trace it to Feuerbach specifically. And ultimately, it's about the realization of humanity, the humanity to realize itself. And that struggle is the mean through which you realize itself. So you become a lot of the people who are committed to these things are professional revolutionaries, right? They jump from struggle to struggle. One of the things that I noticed when I was trying to follow the revolutionary history of Arab societies, that you have all of these revolutionary figures that, for example, they write their memoirs when they are old, and they would carry the title. For example, one of them carries the title "From Fire to Fire." And basically, because his own biography, it's an autobiography, and in it, he basically jumped from one cause to the other, right? He was a Arab nationalist, and once Arab nationalism died, he became a Marxist. And once Islam or Islamism started to rise in the late 70s, he was Christian, but he converted to Islam in order to join the waves of Islamism. I don't think that guy was a genuine Christian or genuine Muslim or anything. He was truly just he became a committed revolutionary, jumping from, as the title of his autobiography suggests, from fire to fire. Just one fire, after it cools down, he just looks for the next thing.
That's so interesting. And just like relating it back for our audience to what's happening on these college campuses, it goes back to what I mentioned in the opening, which is a lot of these students will show up with "Abortion Saves Lives" posters at a pro-Hamas rally, which is it's this concept of solidarity for different causes here in the U.S. that are social justice issues, which is fascinating. I really want to touch on the anti-Semitic roots that are kind of obviously playing out on these American universities. Oftentimes, within the context of anti-Semitism, we think of the Nazis, which do trace their philosophical roots back to the post-Enlightenment German tradition, but also Marxism. Maybe if you could talk briefly on Karl Marx's view of Jews. I know he laid that out in his work on the Jewish question, which our audience can go and read. It's available online. And he really uses, ridding society or liberating society of Judaism as a euphemism for capitalism. So maybe you can tie the anti-Semitic string through a lot of the anti-capitalist sentiments that are also being displayed on American universities.
Uh, yeah, the question of anti-Semitism, I think it's one of, if not the most revealing question of all of this. Whether what's happening today, whether what's been what happened in the '60s, and also before that, and the rise of the Palestinian cause, Nazism, and also a lot of these intellectual system. I mean, I call them German. I mean, they are not German anymore. They truly became universal in a scary way. But that's where they originated. And it's important to understand that, at least the way I understand it. I know this is a primarily Christian podcast. That one way that I understand a lot of these German philosophy, especially from the mid 18th century upward, is that it's an atheized pietism. It was really Protestant. I mean, you can't read the moral philosophy of Kant and not think Protestantism immediately. It was an atheistic one, but basically, it's taking a lot of, and that's why I like also the word post-Christian, because it really, Christian does continue, despite that it's completely severed from any metaphysics. And metaphysics are completely killed, but the systems remained and gets refined philosophically. And in a lot of these early thinkers, first of all, in all of those German thinkers, or there is a German disposition that continued in German nationalism and German romanticism and in various ways of German thinking, of complete disdain to the activity of commerce and anything that has to do with money. And I think that also might have some roots in medieval Christianity or pietism. But here we're talking about things that became philosophical, right? So they are no longer contained in any a theological system. They are really becoming articulated philosophically. So there's a condemnation of commerce. There's a condemnation of any money activity. It's considered to be anti-human. It's anti-good. And it's anti-German, because of course the Germans identified themselves with the higher things, the pursuit of truth, the pursuit of the good, the pursuit of freedom. So it's considered something that is kind of below a lot of the German thinkers. I'm not talking about German liberalism. There was a very strong tradition of German liberalism that will be crushed in the early 20th century. And the Jews were used always as a representation of all of these ills, specifically of money, of capitalism, of the advancing. Capitalism was rising, of course. Capitalism itself is a polemical Marxist term. Free market people never call themselves capitalists, but this is a term that we use anyways. So the advance of liberalism and the free market and the new form of economic activities and industry, a lot of these German thinkers condemn a lot of these activities and considered them Jewish. Jewish in terms of their selfishness, Jewish in terms of their egotism. So the way that a lot of the Germans who were anti-liberals saw liberalism, which included capitalism as the economic component of liberalism, saw it as pure egotism. That is, they condemn it. They are the ones who were talking about something called humanism, something for all of humanity, and also, and nationalism. And that's why all of their ideologies are collectivist by nature. They consider individualism to be a immoral and anti-moral and anti-humanistic. So they saw capitalism as a form of sinister selfishness, the likes of which never really was never really there, and that was articulated philosophically, combined with resentment for Jews and considering them the symbols for that. Now there is a lot of it was usually said, and I think a lot of your audience is familiar with this, that Jews in medieval times were responsible for money changing, and that has to do with the image. I read recently some scholars question this, so I'm not going to get into this. It's not I don't know much about it, anyways. But just the facts is, late 18th, 19th century, Jews associated with money. They are associated with capitalism. Money and capitalism become a philosophical evils, so to speak. And then you get, for example, very clear articulations of this in the writings of, you will find remarks here and there in Hegel. You'll find remarks in, as I said, every single German philosopher wrote left anti-Semitic texts behind them. Um, the most meaningful one, I think, or the beginning, if we really want to trace to our current conditions, I think it has to start with Feuerbach. Feuerbach, as I said, he advanced a new system of, or a new idea. It wasn't a system, it was an idea of atheistic humanism or anthropological humanism, atheism. And it was in a very influential book that was called The Essence of Christianity. The book was primarily a critique of Christianity, that Christianity is a distorted system of alienation of man from his true essence. That is, when you worship Christ, what you're actually worshiping, you're worshiping the powers of man that you've projected, that you squandered and you put into heaven. And basically now Feuerbach is actually helping you to understand that you are that Christ, you are that God, very, very simply put. And in there, he has a section that I think will prove very influential on Marx. Everybody was a student of Feuerbach that came after Feuerbach. Marx was a student of Feuerbach. Hess was a student of Feuerbach. The man who coined the term anti-Semitism, his name is Wilhelm Marr. He was a student of Feuerbach. He edited books of Feuerbach. He published books of Feuerbach. So it really held a lot of sway in people. And he basically, as he philosophically explained Christianity, right? He interpreted Christianity. Now he's the one who demystified Christianity and tell you this is actually what Christianity means. He did the same with Judaism. But it's different. So Christianity is about humanity. It's about love. It's about man. Judaism is about selfishness. It's a gastronomical pleasure of the Jews. The Jews who think about the manna in the desert. For them, for Jews, God is actually their bellies. It's their pleasure. He kind of made this philosophical interpretation of Judaism that was actually quite degrading, but anyways, it had a huge influence. And then from there, you had this massive influence of Feuerbach, as I said, very understudied in American universities in general. Marx took that from him, or took that method. He didn't took exactly the content, but will continue that, and he will have a very famous booklet that was called On the Jewish Question. It was a response to another book by Bauer, also influenced by Feuerbach, On the Jewish Question. And in it, you see the first articulation, really the earliest articulation of what communism is going to be for Karl Marx, which is Judaism is indeed money. It's selfishness. It's pure egotism. And the only reason that Judaism was preserved in history, in Christian history, is because it always carried this economic form in it. So basically, Christian society preserved it, not because they wanted to preserve the Jews, but they wanted to preserve that economic logic or economic rationality that is contained in Judaism, that today, middle 19th century, became the liberalism and capitalism. So basically, Germany became Jewish. And the only way to end the Jewish question, the only way to end the exploitation of the Jews, of course, everything is connected. So you end the exploitation of everyone, and you end the exploitation of everyone by dissolving Judaism, by ending Judaism, or basically liberating Germany. I think that's what he used, liberating Germany from Judaism, by which he meant a capitalism. Now, this argument, a lot of Marxists, of course, later on with how anti-Semitism unfolded in Germany, will be ashamed of this, and there will be a lot of spins around what this actually means. But the truth is, if you actually read all the major anti-Semitic writers at the time and after Marx, that's pretty much what everybody's saying, and that will go right to the heart of Nazism. So you get, for example, Eugene Düring, and Eugene Düring was he started his life as a very committed socialist. He was close to Friedrich Engels, who was the associate of Marx, and Engels, considered him one of the best people who understood Marxism. He left a book called "On the Jewish Question" as well, in which, for example, one of the quotes. Um, uh, if you wish humanity to begin, Judaism must cease to exist. Something of that sort. But the entire book basically is about the same thing. Judaism is selfishness, it's egotism, it's man worship of its most base instinct. And if we want to liberate mankind, so this atheistic humanity can be realized, then we must end Judaism. You had also Werner Sombart. Werner Sombart, I think, was one of the most important, most crucial Marxist theorists. Um, you will seldom hear his name among Marxists because he became he embraced the Nazi Party later, and that of course, any mention of him was taken out. But he was actually one of the most innovative Marxist theorists. Engels said that nobody understood Marx better than Sombart, and Sombart himself left a lot of anti-Semitic writings as well. He has a huge a volume that was called a Jews and Capitalism, in which basically he just had a very rigorous analytical analysis of basically that Jews being the economic logic of alienation, exploitation, and the carriers of. Um, I don't think I have to go. I can name one after the other, one after the other, one after the other. But basically, that became the legacy on which, by the time Hitler was a young man, these were the folk. That was the culture in Germany. There's hundreds of books talks about this. So you have an identification of Jews and Judaism with capitalism, and an identification of capitalism with selfishness, with a disgusting egotism, with a exploitation of man, with the destruction of all values, with the destruction of humanity itself. And you have an association, of course, with America, with capitalism. So you already have that symbolic complex in which America means capitalism, means Jews, means evil, means, and this became truly the folk culture of the radical political movements worldwide. And that's what went also to the Middle East. And it's very important to note these things because I think there's not a lot of memories and that this actually happened in this way. So you have this idea of Nazism as this peculiar, weird movement that came out of nowhere, just suddenly sprouted out of nothing, an aberration of history, and without much understanding of what came before it.
It's so fascinating. Yeah, you hear at these rallies like you're a fascist, and it's restricted to just the right wing, and there's this long left tradition that the Nazis pulled from. So it's so fascinating. Well, Hussein, thank you so much. This was so insightful and so both insightful and comprehensive was the word I was looking for. I think in closing, just to end on a maybe more positive note about the future for these students who really care about the Palestinian cause to self-determine, how can they rethink their activism? What would you challenge them to maybe look inward and maybe reassess their worldviews? What do you think a positive step moving forward could be?
I don't know. I mean, first I want to say to the audience, I understand that these issues sound somewhat archaic, but they're actually very relevant to what's happening today. I mean, and these are, I touched on things very briefly, but remember that these things had huge developments and outgrowth and ideas of coloniality and indigeneity, and imperialism and structural racism, and these are continuations, sadly, with a lot of these of a lot of these ways of thinking. Um, my advice for young people: do not use, which is very hard to do not commit yourself or do not feel very strongly about a concept or a word that you actually don't know where it came from, that you actually don't know its history, that you don't actually know, who started this, where did this come from. I think it's very important. People have an instinct to be socially engaged with their peers, but I think what we need real critical intellect, not the critical intellect that is now being sold, which is the farthest from critical intellect or real reflection of any sort. But I think a lot of obligations goes to the family, to schools, to the professoriate, to actual institutions. We're now in a situation. I am not entirely sure how to fix the university problem. I mean, these intellectual traditions have grown, as I said, without any competition, without much challenge from anybody, and they form the bulk of our social sciences today. And they left a huge legacy, especially that they've been attracting the smartest people for nearly half a century, especially in American universities. I'm not sure how to actually where to start, but I think we should not be satisfied with easy answers. Um, let's pressure the administrators. Let's see where the money's coming from. I think we need a real conversation to actually define what is the university, what is the role of the university in society, what is the healthy relationship of the university of society, and what are the obligations of the university towards society. And what are the obligations of society towards the university? Is it really, should we leave them creating this chaos and mess that they have been creating? And I think these questions need to be asked. So far, I don't see anybody talking about it. You have all the heads of the schools going out making statements filled with these corporate language cliches, building communities, togetherness, these kind of becoming, very cliche language of managerial America. And nobody's actually touching on the real question: what is the role of the university of American society? Or do we need to now think about a new role for the university?
I couldn't agree more. Hussein, where can our audience follow your work and your thought leadership? I know you do a lot in this space.
You can follow me on Twitter. I leave a lot of stuff there, but also on my Substack. If you Google Abrahamic Critique and Digest, that's my Substack. I write extensively there. You will find actually a lot of things that I talked about here briefly. You'll find long essays talking about these things: anti-Semitism as humanism, the history of early Marxism, the history of Neo-Marxism, and how it started in American universities. I try to be I actually try to go into these traditions and understand them from the inside, not just a polemical reading, in order to try to understand them better, in order to try to help the situation. So please, by all means, go, if you like long readings, find the Abrahamic Critique and Digest.
Thank you. I'm going to go spend my evening looking through that. Hussein Mansour, thank you so much.
Thank you.